Now, my starting point for this is, why are we here? What are we talking about and why are we doing this? Next slide, please. Click. Oh, just before we go on to that, one of the things we've done, and one of the useful tools that we've put into place is a guide on next generation broadband networks, the technologies, the funding, and so on and so forth, which many, many people have used, and you can download it from that website. Okay, there is next slide, please. There's an ever-increasing demand for bandwidth, and I think that this is something that we should be very, very aware of. Next slide, please. This is my son. My son is 12 years old now. This photograph was taken last year. He was born in March 2000, and in March 2000, the first broadband connection, consumer broadband connection, was installed in the UK. So a typical 12-year-old, typical middle-class 12-year-old in the UK has grown up with all these services. Click, please. Things that we take for granted, but things that couldn't really exist without first-generation broadband. So, and you can add many, many other services to this. You may note that most of these are American, very few are European, and I think this is a problem that we all face in Europe, throughout the whole of Europe. The second reason that I'm particularly interested in broadband in France is because this is my wife, and she happens to be a hospital doctor. She's a doctor at Lariboisière in Paris at the moment for a few months, and so we have an apartment in the 19th arrondissement. And because we're only there for a few months, we don't have a fixed line connection, so we rely on Orange and free Wi-Fi, which I can tell you is pretty dreadful, but nevertheless it's there and it works a bit some of the time. So I have got an interest in broadband in France. Over the past 10 years, I would argue we've seen a decade of innovation for business, in public services, for communities themselves, whole new ways of working. And one of the things that I note about events like this, next slide please, we run regularly conferences and events, seminars, etc. This is one from July. Press, please. We typically get about 50 people, the same number of people turning up to our events as here. There's a list of the attendees at the event. But we use social media extensively. Twitter didn't really exist for anybody 2 or 3 years ago, but now it is extremely useful. So from a typical event, one person, press again please, one person, Brian Condon, usually does our social media for us. We can get 50 people at the event, 32,000 reached from the event through social media. I don't think anybody's doing that here, but I think it's something you should probably introduce into these sorts of events. The demand for bandwidth is growing exponentially. One of our members, Mark Kellett, CEO of Magnet, a fibre to the home installer in the UK, says that the top 10% of their users are now downloading more than a terabyte a month. That's 1,000 gigabytes a month. And this is something which is really starting to hit networks. Another thing that's happening tremendously, next slide please, is these devices are killing the mobile networks. This is an Android phone. O2 in the UK estimate that their traffic in data is growing at 200% per quarter. Can you press the next slide please? Next. And again. Sorry, I should be doing this myself, shouldn't I? And again. So this is traffic in the UK with these sorts of devices growing at 200%, not a year, but a quarter. So this is why the mobile networks in the UK are extremely keen to offload as much of this traffic as they can onto Wi-Fi networks. Another of our members, Mark Collins from City Fibre Holdings, basically says, next, press again please, what we need to do is we need to get fibre to everything, to the home, the business, the school, the mast, everything we can, get fibre there so we can carry this traffic. Next slide please. And of course the European Digital Agenda, Neelie Kroes is speaking there a couple of months ago in Brussels. She's got a big problem. The 2020 targets are challenging to meet. It means F5 to the home for as much as possible, particularly for the 100 megabit per second target. But of course the incumbents are holding out. Why would you make these investments if you didn't have to? Because at the moment you're making enough money off of the copper networks, and it's very hard for them to make a business case to the financial markets for the investments that are necessary. So Neelie Kroes has got a problem. Some of the tweets I wrote from that event, I think the last one is particularly noted. Ben Verweyen, Chief Executive of Alcatel-Lucent, saying that he thinks it's impossible to meet the 2020 targets. There's more progress on digital competitiveness in Africa than there is in Europe. Simply not acceptable. I think this is something we should be paying attention to. Now, what are the technology choices? Matthias has gone through a lot of these, so I don't really need to talk very much about them. But clearly, fibre to the home, next slide please, is where we want to be heading. It's future-proofed. It doesn't have any speed limits. There are no limits yet found on the capacity of fibre to carry data. It's at terabits per second in some labs in Denmark and other places. There are distance limits, but they're not the same sort of distance limits as exist over copper networks. It's expensive because of the cost of the first mile or last mile build out. I call it the first mile because I'm a consumer and I live at home, and that's the first mile as far as I'm concerned. The telco calls it the last mile because I'm at the end of their network. But that's the expensive bit, clearly, as we know. You can do it on open access. You can have service provider differentiation, lots of different services. So if my mum and dad want to buy a very cheap 5 megabit per second service, they can. I want to have a 100 megabit per second or a gigabit per second service, I can buy that. So you get the ability for service provider differentiation. You get the ability to run symmetrical services. So not only can I see all of us on a holographic image, we can see each other too. We can actually have the symmetric upload capabilities over fibre. And fibre tends to be favoured by non-incumbents because they don't actually have an existing legacy copper network to maintain. So why would you build one of those? You wouldn't. FTTC, VDSL, the next choice. Fibre to the cabinet, VDSL services. These are higher speed than ADSL, current services, but limited by distance in the same way because the last part of the connection is over copper. Needs cabinets close to the customers. It's cheaper to do than fibre to the home for the incumbent. Usually very asymmetric services, much more coming down than going up. Usually designed as consumer-based services, not really thinking in terms of us as being people who run businesses and want to work from home and so on as well. Not fully open access in the sense that certainly in the UK, it's almost impossible economically to unbundle a cabinet. There are 92,000 British telecom cabinets in the UK. You can't really unbundle those. You need a power supply for every cabinet. That certainly has an impact on the carbon footprint, at least in the short term. But nevertheless, it's a way of the incumbents certainly being able to get more out of the existing network than they can otherwise. There's a distance speed trade-off, which I think has been alluded to. If you click again, this is a chart which has been provided by, can you go back one please? Chart provided by one of our members showing that basically once you get over 1,500 meters from the cabinet, you might as well have DSL because that's about the speed you're going to get. So the distance limitations on VDSL are quite significant. It means in rural areas you need to have cabinets there, or you need to start building cabinets, and it starts to the economics then start to get very, very strange indeed, as we've already heard. Cable. Now, cable isn't really talked about hugely in these sorts of meetings, and yet it should be. That's a Virgin Media advert, Usain Bolt playing Richard Branson, talking about the speeds that they're able to get out of their network. Hybrid fibre coaxial networks, they have cabinets with fibre going to them, coaxial connections to homes. In the UK, they represent about 50% of the population, and they can currently deliver 100 megabits per second downstream to 50% of the population from the cable networks. They can't do it upstream. They're quite heavily contended. They're not open access, but they are there. So arguably, the European Digital Agenda targets can, in part at least, be reached by the cable TV companies. They don't really feature heavily in these sorts of debates. Wireless. Fixed wireless and LTE. Well, is this a way that farmers in their sheds can get access to high-speed internet services? Perhaps. Speeds of 30 megabits per second, as we've heard, are achievable. And in the labs, they're rising to 300 megabits per second. So you can actually get speed out of these sorts of services. They offer a cost-effective upgrade path for non-incumbents. So one of the competitive challenges in the UK was a combination, which isn't going to happen, but was a combination of a company called Fujitsu Telecom, who run very large networks on behalf of a whole range of different players, and UK Broadband, a wireless operator with spectrum using LTE. And the plan basically was to use the LTE to establish genuine real demand for services in very rural areas because they're going to be real customers. Once you've got enough real customers using the LTE service, then you've got a case for building out the FTTH service, which Fujitsu Telecom are planning to do. LTE widely supported by mobile phone companies. You've got that interesting link between fixed and mobile that you can do here. Currently it's excluded from the EU guidelines, and the new guidelines on state aid for next generation broadband networks hasn't actually been raised here, but it's a very important topic. There's a consultation out at the moment. Fixed radio is not part of those guidelines. It should be, certainly in my opinion. UK Broadband have made a submission in which they said this. Click please again. Basically, they can deliver on the 30 megabits per second targets today using 4G LTE services. It's there, it's available, and it should be part of the guidelines. And finally, satellite broadband. Now, satellite is being left out entirely of this picture, of certainly next generation broadband. And yet, as we've already heard, satellite is available everywhere in Europe. And frankly, if you're running a small business in a very remote area, for the amount of money it's going to cost you for a dish and you need broadband, you might as well do it. And I think this is something that we don't really think about. You know, £300 for installation, £25 a month, €300, 25 to 30 euros a month, 1 to 10 megabits downstream. Yes, it's contended. Yes, it's latent. There's latency in the signal. The signal has to travel from Earth to the satellite and back again, and that takes time, and therefore you introduce more latency into the process. But for some people, it's going to be very interesting. Now, I was talking to Alexandra, who's from Eutelsat, who's sitting over there, who's I think probably the only satellite person in the room, about this at lunchtime. It's just not sexy anymore. Satellite used to be a sort of sexy thing. You know, when I was a child, it was space, it was fantastic, but it's sort of lost its sexiness, and I think the satellite industry have got a lot to answer for. Click again. I did find one thing which indicates that satellite may be trying to get a bit more sexy in what it's trying to do. This is an advert from one of the companies from Hawaii, but maybe it needs to do a bit more work than that. Alexandra can explain more. Finally, how open is open? I think this is a big question that many people are trying to address. Are we looking for open networks, click again please, fully open networks, or open at the wholesale level? British Telecom in the UK with its Fibre to the Cabinet offering is saying we are open at the wholesale level. We've got lots of service providers who can offer you services. However, few of those service providers can genuinely innovate over BT's network because they can't really access anything other than the active layer. Contrast that with ReggaeFibre in the Netherlands, who have built out around about 1 million fibre to the home connections in the Netherlands, point-to-point fibre, fully open access. There's guaranteed bandwidth, no more up-to speeds, which means that you're buying something which you won't ever get. Service providers can definitely innovate, and ReggaeFibre claim the service providers like it a lot because they can differentiate themselves and offer services to different sorts of customers over the network. So I think this is sort of an interesting area. One of our members, City Fibre, is pushing very hard for a fully private sector invested model, open access. They believe that the city will finance open access networks and their build out if you get the business case right. Public funding, we will hear later, I think, from Matt Yardley, Analysis Mason, about the 5 different models that the European Commission has identified for different ways of funding these networks. In the UK, we're focused only on really one of those mechanisms, which is gap funding the private sector. We're about to spend £530 million worth of central government funding with local match added to that, and some private sector match as well. The gap funding model and the way it's been designed has inevitably favoured the incumbents, so almost all of the money, if not all of the money, is going to go to British Telecom, mainly for Fibre to the Cabinet. There are some bottom-up community-based initiatives, some of the private sector, some of them community-owned. There is a small amount of public funding going into some of those projects. And one of them that I think is interesting doing it for ourselves is in the north of England called b4rn.org.uk. You can look them up. Cooperative model covering 2,000 premises, very, very rural area. The reason they're doing it there is because that's where they live, and they've decided that since they've got terrible broadband services now, unless they do something about it themselves, they're likely to continue to have terrible broadband services. They've decided not to bother with anything other than a fully future-proof solution, which means fibre to the home for all of those premises with gigabit speeds attached. They're not bothering with 100 megabits per second, they're talking gigabit, which is a sort of, you know, it's a totem really. No public subsidy whatsoever. They raised £1 million from their community in the first 6 weeks. They need to raise about £2.5 million. They've got other ways of ensuring that the build-out can be done cheaply. And £1 million in 6 weeks, I think, is pretty good going, really, for that sort of project. So it's interesting to see that people are following the Scandinavian model, where if we can't get it done by the incumbent or by another operator, we have to get together and organise things for ourselves and work together at this. That is it. Just to finish, what we're really talking about here, I think, is something that our chair, a phrase that the chair of Incocoin, Dave Carter, who runs Manchester's Digital Development Agency, this is about a transformational digital infrastructure. Now, I also want to be able to have these holographic images on the desk of us, but also what I really want to see happen is the ability for my son, who is 12 today, to get a really good job in something which is technology related, should he choose to do it, in Europe and not in China. Now, Neelie Kroes pointed out in the Digital Agenda Assembly that there are 35 million fibre to the home connections being built out this year in China. Now, if we don't start catching up in Europe, there's a lot of work going on in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe is really motoring when it comes to this. But in Western Europe, we're well behind. Countries like the UK, Spain and Germany do not even feature in the Fibre to the Home Council's list of countries where there's 1% of Fibre to the Home connections. We're not there. We don't have this. And I think that if we really want to see the benefits of this new telecommunications infrastructure, this new transformational digital infrastructure, we really need to get on with building that infrastructure and making it happen. Thank you very much.